好，现在就让我隆重的先邀请该场次的主持人，来自国立政治大学詹志禹詹教授。詹老师的声音好像还没有办法播出来，老师您有开麦克风吗？
好，大家早安，有听到我的声音吗？
有。
好，非常感动大家在礼拜天的上午这么早的时间就来参与这个国际研讨会哈，何况它的议题是有关乡村教育，是一个涉及可能是弱势团体或者是社会正义的议题，也没任何商业的这个利益潜在利益在里面，结果大家还是这么关心，让我非常的感动啊。那今天上午我还是会以这个中文跟大家互动，因为我们大部分的观众都是来自台湾华语的用者。那为了让那个发表人他能够专心使用单一频道去听口译者，所以我们大部分就都用中文沟通。那口译者会翻成英文，那么发表者他可以单一频道使用，这样会比较简单一点。所以各位等一会提出问答的时候呢，也是可以用中文提出来，不管您是使用口语或者是文字，都可以用中文提出来。那在这一次的场次呢，我们邀请到的是Professor Michael Corbett， 他是从这个 University of British Columbia 获得他的 PhD 学位。那他在学术界的经验非常的丰富，我相信各位有在我们的手册里面看到他非常详细的资历的介绍。那他目前是Acadia University 的教授，同时也是University of Tasmania 的教授哈。他在2个学校都有任教。那他专长的领域蛮多的哈，有包括社会理论、教育社会学哈、课程理论以及乡村教育等等的议题。那今天他要跟我们谈的是有关在加拿大的乡村教育的一些中心的议题。那我们就热烈欢迎Professor Michael Corbett。
I must unmute. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I wish I could be with you in Taiwan, but of course, that's not how the world works these days. I'm coming to you from a very chilly, wintry place at the moment. We're preparing for snow. And yes, I would like to talk a little bit about some general observations, really about the Canadian rural education system. I think the first thing you need to understand, this is a little graphic that in case you don't know where I am, where Canada's that big orange object on the globe that's quite a distance from Taiwan. It's 8:05 p.m. at the moment, so we are almost literally on the other side of the world. The Canadian education system is not a system at all. It is, we're one of the few or a handful of countries that have no national education authority. In fact, Canada has no education ministry at all. There's no federal government presence in education. What we have are 13 discrete provincial and territorial education systems. And the little map that I'm providing here shows you the percentage of rural population, which in Canada is less than 20%, 18.7 in the latest census that we have. But across the country, the percentage of population living in rural areas is as high as 55%, 54.9 in Prince Edward Island, and as low as 13% in Ontario, which is the most heavily industrialized, urbanized province in the country. So I think, you know, the big background issues right now in rural Canada are questions of immigration. How do we bring people in and maintain stable populations? Canadian rural areas have been losing population or have stagnant population for the past 40 or 50 years. So the emerging discussion about rural development and rural education, rural policy generally, is to maintain population in rural areas. The second large conversation that's going on across the country is in terms of educational inequality. Now, this is geographic inequality between places, but it's also geographic inequality in terms of differently racialized populations, visible minorities, and particularly Indigenous people in the country. And I'll have a bit more to say about that in a few minutes. So the first problem, I think, in rural education, really, and rural generally, is to define what it means. And there are a number of ways that rurality has been defined, but I think the work that I do, I pay attention to contemporary geographers, and I'm drawing here on the work of Edward Soja, who's an American cultural geographer, who draws on Henri Lefebvre, who's a French geographer. And Lefebvre and Soja look at space in terms of layers, 3 layers. They don't think about space as a kind of flat Cartesian plane. It's now understood that contemporary geography looks at space in 3 basic dimensions. And first of all, what Lefebvre and Soja call perceived space. That's the material space that you see with your eyes, in a sense. Secondly, there's conceived space, which is the way that space is represented symbolically, and that can either be through images, it can be through language, it can be through mathematics, it can be through maps, any form of symbolic representation. And the third layer is lived space, how people experience spatiality, how they experience being in a place. And each of these 3 dimensions of space work together to create a very complex, multi-layered sense of what it is to be in a place and how space actually operates. So perceived space, depending on where you live in Canada, you will see rural landscapes that look like one or the other of these pictures. The top right-hand side is a large farming area, the Western Prairies, heavily industrialized agriculture. The next one over is a place much like the one I'm sitting in, a fishing community where it's close to the ocean. The communities huddle around the edge and they work through the sea. There are also logging communities, many of which are, an important rural problem in Canada at the moment is deforestation and the extraction of resources in particularly oil and mining in many rural areas. So rural areas are often what Mark Edelman calls sacrifice zones. They're areas that have material resources taken out of them and they're just kind of left. Saskia Sassen calls it for dead. Land is actually destroyed by these processes. Other rural communities are Arctic communities like the one pictured on the bottom. So the perceived rural space is very diverse in Canada. Conceived space as well is, rurality can be understood in as many possible ways as you can imagine. So the picture of the tractor in a grain field is one kind of normal, common rural image. But the map on the right, actually, all of that green is area that is classified as rural. In fact, Canada's urban geographic physical geography is very tiny. It's less than 1% of the total land mass of the country. And rural, of course, can be also represented by words. And I guess this is the kind of work that people like me do. We create and we think about what constitutes rurality. And finally, lived space. And these images are taken from a small school community that I work with. And these images all relate to community members fighting to save their school from being closed because they're in a rural area where the population is declining and the provincial government no longer sees fit to fund the school. So these communities fight to save their schools. So, you know, the lived experience of living in an area in terms of rural education, I think is also an important dimension of space. So conceptions, these are the images that are common when many Canadians, North Americans think about what's rural. You know, you have these images of rough, tough men who work hard on the land or in the sea, and you know, people who live in the bush, they hunt, they fish, they do agricultural kinds of things. And then you have the visualizations. Annotate the show, my gee, how do I do that? I think I'm going to have to decline that. I don't think I can figure that out. I've been asked to annotate, and I'm sorry, I'm not able to do that. Visualizations, and this again is that first map that I showed you, that takes the idea of rurality and creates a static definition. So it creates this binary that you have urban people and you have rural people, and there is a population density formula that is used to create that definition. So that's a conception of rurality. It's not the only one, though. More commonly these days, we use a mobile conception or a mobile definition of rurality, the Metropolitan Influence Zone, the MIZ. And what the MIZ does is it shows not only the size of communities, the white lines here are communities of more than 100,000. And some of our provinces, much of the population lives in communities of more than 100,000. But you'll see on the bottom of the screen, some of our territories and provinces have people living in very tiny communities, which are the diagonal line communities at the bottom. So there's a great deal of diversity in terms of rurality and how close people are living to urban areas across the country. So rural is a very complicated thing. I've circled Nova Scotia because that's where I am. And you can see that we have a number of very small communities as well as large ones. And this is another map of Nova Scotia where I am. I'm very close to Halifax, the city that's in the red zone there, which is the only urban area really in my part of Canada. We have in Nova Scotia very few isolated areas, and the only ones that exist are Indigenous communities, and I'll have a bit more to say about that in a few minutes, because that I think is a very important part of spatial inequality in Canada. Okay, so how does this all relate to education? And I'll talk about this in a couple of ways. First of all, I'll use the Project for International Student Assessment, which is operated by the OECD. I expect you know about it. These are the raw scores for, and I've put Chinese Taipei there along with Canada. So in the top two columns, you can see we're very similar in lots of ways. In Canada, slightly higher reading score. Taipei, slightly higher math score. Science scores are about the same. And we actually have a similar kind of static rural-urban percentage in our national populations as well, with Chinese Taipei at 22.9 according to the UN, and this is data from a couple of years ago, I think. I hope it's accurate. And the 2016 Canadian census, which designated 18.7% of the national population. But as you move down and take a look at the different provinces, of course, you see different levels of rurality. Ontario, 13.8%, Alberta, 16.4%. These are more populous provinces. Quebec, 19%. And Nova Scotia, where I live, 42.6%. So I live in a part of the country that by these designations is highly rural. It's a very strong proportion of the population. And if you take a look at the PISA scores in reading, mathematics, and science, Nova Scotia is generally lower. And so this illustrates, I think, a little bit the connection. I'm not going to call it a correlation. It isn't that at all. But it's, I think it's a common feature across the country that those provinces which are more heavily rural also tend to perform slightly less well in the measures of standardized measures of education, like the PISA. Also, in just looking at the province of Nova Scotia, where I am, in terms of youth unemployment, those who live in the metropolitan area, they're slightly more likely to be working. Unemployment is higher outside the cities. But what really stands out is that educational attainment in the province is quite different for rural and urban youth. Rural youth, 13% have no certificate, which means they have not completed secondary education. And only 17% are in university, compared to 27% in the urban areas. So these are, I think, important differences that you see in terms of rural-urban space. And there are also ways of representing rurality in relation to education. So it's difficult to make general conclusions about Canadian rural education because we have no centralized national system. We have, as I mentioned, 13 different systems. But what we do know is that higher education and universities particularly tend to be located in cities, and that the opportunity costs and distance factors are significant for rural youth. Rural youth participation rates are considerably lower, and their completion rates in post-secondary programs are lower, regardless of where they are in the country, and also when controlling for family background, socioeconomic status, these kinds of things, the relationship holds up. So rural youth do not complete post-secondary education at the same level that urban youth do. We also see from PISA data and other forms of testing at the provincial level that community size is very powerfully associated with results in academic skills, performance, and standardized testing. But what quantitative and qualitative analysis show is that the diversity of places that get classified as rural well, there's a great diversity. Not all rural places are the same, and many rural places actually perform very well. So the picture is not simple. The big concern these days in terms of rural policy is a concern about how to keep young people in the communities, how to keep rural populations from stagnating and falling. And this data that I'm showing you here, it's not important that you look at the whole thing, but as a picture, what you see on the right-hand side of this graph is that from 2014, Nova Scotia has been losing population due to natural progression, natural population change. We're not having enough children in this province to replace the current population. And this has been happening since about 2012. And it was considered a major crisis for the province. And some things were done about this. When you take a look at the actual population change for the same period from 2000 to 2020, you can actually see that our population begins to grow in 2015. And, you know, I think it should be obvious what's happening here. How is it that you can have natural population decrease, people not having enough children to replace the population, and yet the population goes up? Well, the answer is immigration. And over the last 6 or 7 years, the province and the Canadian, most Canadian provinces, but particularly the heavily rural provinces like Nova Scotia, have become very invested in encouraging immigration through policy, through support systems for immigrants, for attraction, to get people into rural areas and to keep them there. And it has been successful. It's worked very well, as you can see from that population graph. And this one shows the net in migration. So you can see from 92 through to 2014, there's not much movement. There's a little bit, some years the province gains a few people through migration, some years it loses a few, but once you hit 2014, 2015, when the policy change came into effect, Nova Scotia begins attracting and retaining a lot of people. There's a little blip for COVID in 2019, but by the end of 2020, things were starting to tick upward again. So COVID, I mean, this is the subject of your conference. What can I say about that? Not a great deal. I mean, it's really difficult to know at this stage what's happening, but I can share a few things. And this is some data compiled by a colleague of mine, Ray Bowman, who was looking at, and what this graph shows is the basically the loss of jobs, the loss of employment, looking back 1 year. So if you look back 1 year from any of these points along the graph, you can see that beginning in March of 2020, when COVID became an issue, the jobs begin to disappear. They lose jobs. Now, the brown and the green here indicate, the brown lines indicate larger urban centers across, this is Canadian data, it's not Nova Scotia. While the green lines indicate rural and small town areas. And what Bowman found was that rural areas were losing fewer jobs relative to larger urban centers for the first part of the pandemic. But as we move into June, July, August, September of 2021, more recent data, it's exactly the opposite. So the labor markets in urban areas are coming back over the last 5 or 6 months, while the rural labor markets have not been coming back quite so quickly. You can also see this graph shows youth unemployment between September 2019 and September 2020. And you can see here that obviously youth unemployment and all unemployment has gone up considerably from the time of sort of the pre-pandemic to after pandemic situation is in force. And particularly men 15 to 24, and even more so women 15 to 24 have seen their unemployment rates skyrocket and move up considerably. We can talk a little bit, if you want, later about why it is that male unemployment rates are higher than female unemployment rates amongst young people as we move on. And you can also see the impact of unemployment is not it's bad, but it isn't so bad with older people in the population. So these are all conceived ideas. Like I'm showing you some data about rural space. But what about the lived experience of rural schooling? And I think I want to talk here about a few features of education and training in rural areas that are significant and different. And the first one is the tyranny of distance, I'm calling it. Secondly, small is beautiful. Thirdly, the academic vocational divide, and fourthly, learning to leave, which is a phenomenon that I've studied and written about. First of all, the tyranny of distance. In a geography as massive as Canada, it's extremely expensive and very logistically difficult for rural school systems to operate. It can be very difficult to transport young people to school. Distances are quite vast in some areas. And rural school promoters or operators face many costs that don't exist in larger urban spaces. And of course, we know that schools function more efficiently when you have a large cluster of people in a relatively tight geography. So that's a fairly obvious and long-standing problem in rural education. Secondly, not all rural students, of course, have access to private transportation that can support children's work at school, children's particularly extra and co-curricular activities beyond the school, but also broadband access. Many rural areas have limited or no access to broadband. Also, rural areas tend to be less wealthy overall. So there are higher rates of poverty, there are higher rates of health kinds of problems. There are many sort of associated problems with isolation and economic capacity in rural communities. And finally, most of the post-secondary educational opportunities available to young people are not in rural communities. They're in larger towns or cities. So there are higher costs, financial costs and emotional costs for young people who have to leave their homes to continue with their schooling. Secondly, unique feature, I think, of rural education is there's a great deal written in the field of rural education, particularly in the United States, but also in Australia as well, where I think the field is kind of most highly developed. That rural education is very often promoted as a strength, that schools are small. Because they're small, there's an intimate connection between teachers and students. Teachers know the families, they understand the areas. Many times the teachers come from the small communities themselves. So rural schools are very often promoted by rural education scholars and promoters as a kind of advantage rather than a deficit. And there's been a great deal written as scholars have attempted to fight the idea or push against the idea that rural communities produce substandard educational products. And the argument goes exactly the opposite. And, we do know, I think, through years of curriculum theory and experience that locally developed, experientially based forms of schooling can be very powerful and can be very effective. And yet, the downside of this is that these locally developed solutions can tend toward insularity. I think we're seeing in rural Canada, rural North America, what gets called populism, what gets called insularity. The Donald Trump phenomenon is very much connected to rural voters who have very conservative views, who see themselves as somehow exceptional or special, and who don't really want to be part of a larger society, and who will tend to gravitate toward political options that are insular, I guess is the word I would use. So there is this kind of connection as well. I think another thing that rural students face is that because their schools tend to be smaller, most rural schools offer fewer choices and tighter streams, which means that a child has to make decisions, usually at age 13, 14 in our country, about which route they're going to take. Are they going to move in a vocational direction or an academic direction? And in rural areas, very often the academic programs are they select a certain group of young people to move out of the community, to go away, and to become essentially urban through the academic pipeline. And the vocational track tends to be those young people who are more inclined to stay or who don't have the resources to do anything else. So the connection between the academic track and out-migration and leaving is something I've been quite interested in. And this is a picture of a book that I wrote about this. So the question that I was asking in this book is who stays, who leaves, and why in a rural community where I worked for about 10 years as a teacher. And when I spoke to people about this in my qualitative and quantitative research, education success was conflated or connected to leaving, and this notion of the brain drain as young people who are able are shifted away from the rural areas. This creates a problem, a kind of vacuum in those communities of leadership, and some of the most capable people leave. These communities also, in my research, I found much lower overall levels of educational attainment and some very anti-education attitudes and insular rural identity politics, I call it. You know, people who see themselves as rural people who are tough, resilient, common sense, not academic people. They're, you know, salt of the earth, and not the sorts of people who worry about silly things like reading books and Shakespeare and these things. These are practical people, they would see themselves as. And so this tension between life in the local area and what goes on in school and the purposes of education is something that I found to be deeply problematic and challenging. How's my time now? I've got a few minutes left. So some challenges. Some of the work that I've done and others have done demonstrate educational outcomes in urban adjacent rural areas are quite similar to metro areas. So this is the problem of not all rural areas are the same. In that binary framing of rural urban, some spaces that get defined administratively as rural are actually bedroom communities for cities where workers move in and out. And what we have found is that the further you move away from the metropolis, the weaker the outcomes. I've said that before. But the super peripheries, and Canada is a vast geography, and places that are very remote are markedly different from the general rural demographic. And finally, the outcomes for visible minorities and historically disadvantaged groups, particularly Indigenous people, are markedly different, especially when they're combined with geographic isolation or peripherality. And I'll have a few slides to show you about this. So this is a slide that illustrates the percentage of individuals aged 20 to 22 who have no high school diploma. They have not completed secondary education. And you can see that in the larger communities, the census metropolitan areas, 100,000 plus, fewer than 10%. So 90+% complete high school. When you move out here to the most isolated rural territories, fewer than 50%, or more than 50% do not complete high school. And as the communities get larger, the percentage of youth who do not complete grows, okay? But if you tease out of that data the non-Aboriginal population, you get a very different picture. And what you see here is the same data comparing 2001 and 2016. And you can see that the relationship sort of worked in 2001. There was, you know, as the communities oh, actually it didn't, I'm sorry. As the communities got, yes it did, I'm sorry. As the communities got bigger, the percentage of young people not completing school was smaller. But look at what happens in 2016. Young people in the very small, isolated rural areas who are not Aboriginal are very similar to the young people living in large communities, large cities. So it's obviously not just a question of, is it rural or urban? It's who's in this area. And if you take a look at Aboriginal youth living in differently sized communities, you'll see that Aboriginal youth have horrific dropout rates, very, very high. And they continue to be very, very high from 2001 to 2016, to the point where in the most remote communities, dropout rates are 55 or so percent, and down from 60% in 2001. That's, you know, it's some progress, but it isn't much to boast about. So there's a very different experience for different individuals living within these geographic boundaries. So I think it's really important that we find ways to integrate vocational and academic programming and get around this learning to leave academic vocational binary. And this is the work that I'm very interested in these days, to recognize that this binary is problematic, to deconstruct it, to try to help young people think about themselves differently, and to be able to imagine their own identities as ones that can take on academic work and you can still be a good person in your community. And yeah, these are sort of the problems that we're working on these days. It's becoming increasingly clear that in the traditional rural industries, like primary resource industries, fishing, farming, mining, and so forth, we need educated people. These industries are becoming mechanized and they're highly productive, but there is much less need for the typical, you know, tough rural man who was very good at manual labor. And of course, COVID has shifted everything. And I can talk in a little bit more detail about what that looks like if anybody wishes to in the question section. But it's created a new demand for labor. There are intense labor shortages throughout Canada, rural and urban. A big concern for many rural communities is how are we going to keep our young people in the rural regions? And very often in the political climate of the moment, rural people will say, and the rural politicians very often say, that we can't bring in immigrants because it will take away the jobs and more of our young people will have to leave. Well, this data actually shows it's been the exact opposite. And the red line here is the 15 to 34 years of age people. And it illustrates that from about 1984 through to 2015, they were leaving. This is Nova Scotia data. In 2014, when the new immigration policy came in and we became more welcoming of immigrants, what happens is that the young people, our own young people, are actually much more likely to stay. That red line goes out and comes up above zero. So we're no longer losing young people. And this is, I think, an important, unanticipated by many rural people relationship. So we have this irony of labor shortages and high unemployment at the same time. This is all being changed very radically by COVID. What's happened in Nova Scotia is we've had a real estate boom. There's been a movement of people from the larger cities into the smaller cities and actually into the rural areas. I live in a small fishing village. The house across the street from me was bought by a real estate banker and a judge from Toronto who have come to take this place and live in a rural area. So, and this has been a very strange and interesting effect of COVID-19 as many, there's a population shift happening in Canada. Whether it will be permanent or not, we don't know. But at the moment, population growth in my rural part of Canada is actually growing. Restaurants, particularly service industries, are having a hard time keeping people. I've gone over time, so I will just finish up here. There are a number of things schools are doing. Place-sensitive education to try to connect rural places with the educational project. Some communities have developed schools as what are called multi-service community hubs, where the school also contains childcare, adult education, employment services, health services, recreation services built into the same facility, communication centers. There are a couple of teacher education programs in Canada that focus on preparing teachers to work in rural areas. I can talk a bit about that if people have questions. And finally, diversity initiatives. And not only do we have to prepare labor for the labor market, I think we have to prepare the society to become more welcoming, and this is becoming recognized across the country, that diversity, equity, inclusion, these kinds of conversations have become front and center in many educational policy initiatives. And in rural areas, this is particularly, I think, significant and important work. And I think that's it. I'll just leave this on the screen if I can for a second, a couple of points to consider, and I will stop.
好，感谢 Dr. Corbett 对加拿大乡村教育做的介绍，让我们有机会了解台湾跟加拿大乡村教育之间，它的相似性或者它的相异性等等。那我们现在就欢迎大家提出问题来。那您可以口头提出来，也可以这个透过 Slido 或者是Q&A 的部分去提出来。那我目前还没有看到任何的那个书面的问题。有没有人要口头上提出来问题了？书面我还没看到任何 ，Slido 上面好像也没看到任何的问题。
那个 Slido 上面有4题了，老师。老师有看到吗？
怎么样
？Slido 上面已经有4题。
Okay, get out of the chat.
那我的部分为什么看不到？
好，要不然就我来分享。
在我的面板上面，那个 Q&A 以及 Slido 都是空白的。
I see one question that's in English. I could respond to it if that's okay.
好啊，好啊，OK， 请。
Okay, where is it? Okay. This week's Economist magazine reports the rise of remote work has started a trend of internal migration from urban to rural. What's the impact of such trend? Yeah, this is what I was talking about at the end. If I knew that, I could make a lot of money if I knew the answer to that question, because this is really a question that many people living in rural areas are asking day to day. My house was worth, I don't know, $250,000 when COVID started. Now it's probably worth twice that much money. The value of my home. Will that value hold up? And I think a lot of rural people are asking themselves, well, this is a strategic question. Will this market hold up, or will it fall apart when COVID comes under control? So we really don't know. But what we have been seeing is that there's been a new interest in places that are outside of the cities, the urban concentrations, people who have money, who have the resources, and can work remotely, are, I think, considering the possibility of moving out of the cities, working remotely, living in a place where you can have, where real estate values are much, much lower compared to the large areas like Toronto. I mean, if I had a house in Toronto, I could sell it for $3 million and come out here and buy a palace, in the rural areas. So, these are questions that many people, and frankly, I'm asking it myself. Will this hold up? My guess is that it will not. I think when COVID is back under control, we'll see a shift and things will settle back, but I could be wrong about that. So that was the one question that was in English that I could respond to.
好，其他的问题，我现在有看到一个很高跳的问题，大家对于乡村怎么样有效吸引移民的政策，
Okay.
所以他请教的是加拿大的乡村，它有效吸引移民的政策有哪些啊？我们都很好奇。请。
Yeah, they've set up a number of support systems for immigrants. Well, first of all, there's attractions. Nova Scotia advertises around the world to get immigrants. One of the main areas that we've really been working to get people is for agricultural workers. So there's been an established program where people have come mainly from Mexico and the Caribbean to work in agriculture. But we're also looking for more highly skilled people in all sorts of places. So there is this advertising. Nova Scotia has 10 universities for a population of 1 million people. So we bring in, these universities are internationalizing, and I think it's about 12 or 13% of the student population in our universities are now foreign students. And it's become much easier for students who come here to go to university to remain, to stay. Particularly if they have skills in an area where there are labor shortages. And there are labor shortages in just about every professional area. So it's become much easier for those folks to stay in. And we've built, I think, a much better system of integration to try to support through language training, through support with immigration processes. It's become easier to both enter the country, and there's a lot more being done to support people once they're here. The schools have also, especially in Halifax, the city, have become much more responsive to diverse students and what we call new Canadians, people who come in from other countries and who need language training and who need various kinds of support to get in a position where they can work and contribute more effectively to the society. So come if you want to. Come visit. Come live here. It's very beautiful.
好，还有一个问题也很高票的是，他请问说，是否可能为乡村型的农村教育带来另一种透过网络整合各个乡村教育所带来的多元性教育的内容选择的新契机，为农村留住更多青年，也就是透过网络得以在自己的乡村接受很多元的教育。总之，他想知道的是有没有可能透过网络的整合，来带给乡村教育更多元性的教育内容，将来留住更多的青年。
That's a really interesting question. I certainly think that teachers and education systems through COVID have had to, the word we use is pivot to online learning. So we're used to doing this classroom work, and we've had to move the whole show into a forum like this one. And I think that has, in many cases, it's upskilled teachers. Teachers have become more effective at using these technologies. Frankly, I think teachers were, prior to COVID, not all, but many teachers were not particularly sophisticated in terms of their ability to use information technologies in their teaching. I think all teachers have, at this point, a basic level of fluency in using digital tools to do teaching. And I don't think that would have happened if COVID hadn't come along. So yeah, there is certainly a bright side. Now, will this continue? Will we be able to take advantage of this opportunity? I think I've heard somewhere there's a saying in Chinese that there's a, every challenge is an opportunity. Every disaster gives you opportunity to do something different, to see the world in a new way. And I think there is evidence. I mean, that's what your question is, a really good research question. I think I wish I had a PhD student who was actually looking at that sort of question. Has the pivot to online education actually made it easier for young people? One other thing that I would say is that what we've learned in this pandemic is the extent to which young people in rural communities don't have any access at all. They have no broadband access. So what the pandemic has also done is it's shown the cracks in the system and how people living in low-income situations very often don't have computers, very often don't have any internet connection. And the systems have become pretty responsive, I think. Not completely, but they've done work to try to provide computers, Chromebooks to children for free so that they can do their work, which I think has probably connected some families to the internet for the first time. So what we have seen through this pandemic is how diverse our communities are and how my wife works for a school system here in this part of rural Nova Scotia, and I think she was saying that they calculated that something like 20% of their students had no effective broadband. And they realized that in order to do online education during the pandemic, these young people have to have something. And so they began to develop strategies. to connect these kids. My university, and maybe your university as well, went completely online last year, and it looks like we're going to be going back online after Christmas. So, you know, we are developing the fluency and facility. I mean, there is no reason why we can't deliver many forms of education at a distance, and I think we're beginning to see that. And yeah, I'm kind of cynical sometimes. I think the university is going to use this as a way just to make more money, to be able to, you know, online is cheap, right? It's not very expensive. You can have Professor Corbett, you can have 100 people in a Zoom room, and away you go. Big money for the university. So I hope that doesn't happen. You know, I hope we figure out ways to use the opportunity without destroying the institution at the same time.
好，那下面还有一个问题，也有很多人感兴趣的是，他想请问那个乡村教育就是为了乡村教育的师资培训，那应该强调哪些特质与能力，才能帮助减少目前的不平等或者经济差距的现象？在师资培训上面应该强调哪些特质与能力？
Yeah, another very good question. I think most of the teachers, I do teacher education, most of the young people that I teach, no, they're not all young, some are older people coming back to become teachers. They come from cities, they come from large towns, and they have a lot of myths in their heads about what a rural place is. And often those myths get in the way of them becoming effective teachers. In fact, often those myths make it so that they don't want to go anywhere near a rural place. And I think one of the things that is important to do is to work with young people to help them understand that the diversity conversations, the inclusion conversations, the equity conversations that we have about racialized minorities, that we have about social class, like poor kids, low SES kids, also need to apply to young people who come from small, remote communities. So it's a form of diversity and inclusivity. And I think one of the best ways to make, you know, to support young people in teacher education to become, you know, potentially rural teachers is to actually have them do practice teaching in rural areas, have them visit rural communities, have them spend time in rural communities, and to realize that they're interesting places. They're places where there are a lot of jobs, there are a lot of opportunities for you, and they're not horrible places to live. They can actually be a very nice place to raise a family and to have a good career. And this is what I do in my teaching. I spent 20 years as a public school teacher in a rural community, and I loved it. And if you take you know, the position that you're a learner, that this is a place where you can come into and you can learn so much yourself about nature, you can learn so much about people, you can learn so much about your society. I learned how to fish and do many of the things that people in rural communities do, and I've come to love that very much. So for me, it was a gift to become a rural teacher and to work in a rural community. And I try to transmit that enthusiasm to my students, because I think it's important that they get over the idea that the only place in the world is a city with pavement. You know, there are lots of places that are worthy and interesting And, if you're looking for a place to go and do service, for your society, for your country, I think there's no better place. I started my teaching career in a small Indigenous community in the north of Canada, an isolated community. And I learned more in those 4 years than at any other point in my life. And so this is what I tell my students. If you really want to learn something, if you're a learner, get out of your comfort zone and go to some place that is completely different from what you know. Be brave, be courageous. It's good.
虽然我们时间已经差不多了，但是我是不是可以再请教最后一个问题？这个也是蛮多观众很感兴趣的，就是说为了呼应族群文化的传承跟教师经验的累积，加拿大是不是有优先扶植当地族群文化背景的教师的增能跟认证？那有没有这个对教育翻转有没有帮助？
Yeah, that's a good question. I've just published a book on rural teacher education in Canada with a colleague from the University of Calgary, where they have this program. They call it Homegrown Teachers. And the Homegrown Teacher Program attempts to take people in the community who wouldn't necessarily think that they were able to become teachers. Very often people who work in the school as teaching assistants, or who are parents in the local school who are very active and who have an interest in education. And this program encourages those people to do a teacher education degree. And the University of Calgary provides this through distance education, this program, so that people can remain in their rural communities, but also take this teacher education course. The students are brought to campus for, I think, 4 or 5 weeks in the summertime. So they come together from all of these various rural communities around Alberta, and they have a period of time where they get together and they work together with their professors at the university in the city. And then they go back to their communities and they're doing courses while they're working in schools. And it has been reasonably successful. We also have had historically in Canada a number of programs in Indigenous communities to train Indigenous teachers. And these programs have produced a fairly large number of Indigenous teachers. When I was teaching in Manitoba, northern Manitoba, in the Indigenous community in the mid-1980s, there was one Indigenous teacher on a staff of 30. I think in that same school now, it's about 15, half and half Indigenous teachers, half Southern, let's call them white teachers. I hate that word, but so European descended teachers. So the programs do work, and I think it's important that that we attempt to set these programs up as much as we can, and they're most important, I think, in those very remote communities where teacher retention is a huge problem. And there have been a number of schemes over the years to try to attract Southern teachers to northern communities, but none of them have really worked very well. Teachers tend to go, I spent 4 years in a northern community, and that was a lot. For not many Southern teachers lasted as long as that. I do think it's important that we have a group. Now, I also think that these remote communities need to have diverse teachers from other places too. I think it's really important that not all of the teachers come from the community. And that's a different kind of problem in some rural areas that here in Nova Scotia, where, there are 5 teachers in a small school and one person gets in there and they're in for 30 years and, their son becomes a teacher and it's like a, king for life or something, job in some rural community. So it depends, it's a complicated question, but I think these programs are important.
好，那我想，因为我们这个场次的时间已经超过了哈，我就不方便再转达更多的提问哈。那很感谢我们的观众提问非常的热切哈，然后也很感谢Professor Corbett 非常热情的回应哈。我相信各位从今天的这一场次的这个演讲跟讨论里面，我们可以发现，台湾跟加拿大之间其实也有蛮多的相似性，那当然也存在一些差异性。在相似性上面，包括譬如说像人口趋势，我觉得就蛮相似的哈。那另外有关疫情影响的后果，譬如说对经济差异性的影响、对教育的影响等等，这些影响的后果也都蛮相似的。那另外有关乡村教育的困境以及大家努力的方向当中，有一部分其实也是蛮相似的。譬如说，我们的人口有外流的问题，所以我们的乡村教育其实也是蛮希望可以留住青年，或者可以帮助青年返乡，这个方向是蛮相似的。另外，我们其实目前12年国教也是一直在追求学术跟职业的混合，然后过去在中学慢慢走向综合高中。其实也是跟今天Professor Corbett 所主张的学术跟职业的这种混合或综合方向也是蛮一致的。那另外有关混龄的方向，这个在政策上方向上也是蛮相似的。然后以及最后刚刚提到的有关鼓励青年返乡等等，这个我觉得在两边都颇为相似。那当然也有一些差异的地方，譬如说像台湾。我们的乡村其实，父母亲有大部分并不会反对教育，反而是还蛮尊重教育，或者是还蛮依赖教育，蛮希望他的孩子有透过教育而翻身的机会。那甚至我们会担心的，是有些地方仍然是升学取向过强的问题，而不是说会会觉得教育不够价值不足的问题。那所以这个看起来是有差异性的。另外我们面临的是教师流动率比较高，或者是家庭功能不足的问题。这个是我们台湾在乡村教育上面比较不晓得是不是独特的问题，因为目前看起来加拿大是 Dr. Corbett 是没有提到这方面，也许这个是两边也有它的差异性。不过可惜我们今天时间还是不充足，还没有办法有这个充分的机会做更深入、更进一步的交流。我们希望未来还有机会能够再跟 Dr. Corbett 做更多的交流。那希望今天只是一个开始，而不是一个结束。然后也很感谢我们的观众在周日上午这么热情参与这个研讨会，以及这么热情提出非常有内涵跟深度的问题。那我们剩下的时间就保留给大家可以做一点休息。我们这个场次就暂时到这里为止。我们再度谢谢Professor Corbett 精彩的演讲。
好，那我们第一场的主题演讲已经暂时告一段落。那也请观众如果你方便的话
It was wonderful to be here, and I do wish I could see you and be with you, but perhaps one day.
我们也是。那观众如果可以用表情符号或者是文字呢，那给我们的演讲者跟主持人一些回馈。那现在呢，到等一下的9点半呢，是我们第一场次的中场休息时间。然后呢，我刚看到那个谢小琴教授已经在线上了。 那如果教授想要在这个时候测试一下声音跟镜头的话，也是可以的。那其他的观众，我们大家就把握时间，好好的休息一下，9点半再准时回来哦。再见。